Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining our first ever EWG PFAS conference and for your interest in this panel on firefighters and PFAS. Firefighters are one of the most highly exposed populations to PFAS, and they have also been among the fiercest advocates for change. And it's my honor to introduce three wonderful firefighters who are joining us as speakers today: Brian Goodman, Sean Mitchell, and Kevin Ferrara. Each panelist is going to have an opportunity to speak and share a bit of their story, and then if there's time, I'm going to accept some audience questions. Brian Goodman is a 14-year firefighter, writer, and advocate who's based out of Virginia. He's going to share his family's personal struggle with the health effects from PFAS exposure in firefighter turnout gear. After Brian, we'll hear from Sean Mitchell, the Deputy Chief of the Nantucket Fire Department. Sean has worked with his own fire department in town to seek out less toxic turnout gear. He is also a national advocate for firefighters and has worked to pass an International Association of Firefighters resolution to turn down sponsorships from chemical and equipment manufacturers and demand independent tests of PFAS in gear. And then finally, we'll hear from Kevin Ferrara, who's been a firefighter for over 33 years, beginning as a volunteer firefighter in central Pennsylvania. Kevin began his 20-year military career in the former Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois, where he received training and certification as an apprentice fire protection specialist. Throughout his military career, Kevin has served in various roles such as firefighter and instructor, providing specialized technical rescue training. And today he's running a consulting business. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Brian Goodman to share his story with you.
Hello. First, I would like to thank the Environmental Working Group for inviting me to share my personal story and opinions. It's an honor to be included amongst these accomplished speakers. Today I'm going to be representing myself, not any department or municipality. My name is Brian Goodman, as stated. I'm a 14-year fire lieutenant. I spent 11 years at some of the busiest houses in the nation. As a firefighter, I've been heavily exposed to PFAS. This exposure has led to my infertility. I had an occupational exposure 33% of the year, every year, for 14 years. Today, my goal is to protect my fellow brother and sister firefighters and the individuals we serve across the country from having to experience what I have. Before I go into my story, I'd like for a moment to go slightly off script. I'd like y'all to imagine meeting your perfect significant other. Imagine meeting them, your best friend and the love of your life, in your early 30s, and get married. Imagine you both have worked tirelessly on your education and your careers to elevate yourselves. Imagine you both are in the service professions and are proud about the opportunity to give back to your community. All this only to find out a few years later you can't give your significant other a child due to the chemicals that are saturated in firefighter protective gear and station uniforms. This is exactly where my story starts. In May 2020, my wife and I thought our dream of having a family was about to come true. My wife was 10 days late but never shared a positive pregnancy test. She informed me she thought she was having a miscarriage. Unfortunately, all this was taking place during a global pandemic. We immediately called my wife's OB to be told that they weren't accepting patients. After many phone calls, her doctor finally agreed to see her. Initially, the focus was on my wife. After many invasive and humiliating tests, no abnormalities were found, and we never found out whether or not she had a miscarriage. The focus turned to me. Multiple blood tests and semen analysis were ordered. Ultimately, the results from those tests were heartbreaking. They found no sperm and noted abnormal hormones. What followed today still seems like a blur. First, I had a brain MRI which showed a tiny benign tumor on my pituitary gland. This was ultimately ruled out as an issue. Then came genetic testing. No abnormalities were found. No deletions were noted on my chromosomes. I had a total of 6 semen analysis. I had my blood drawn 14 times for hormone testing and monitoring. The only abnormalities found were with testosterone and estradiol, neither of which to this day I can control. I had a testicular biopsy that looked for sperm cancer. It found neither. I had been placed on hormone therapy and chemo to try to control the testosterone and estradiol levels. Both were ineffective. 3 months after the biopsy was performed, I had microtesticular sperm extraction surgery. My testicles, widely considered one of the more sensitive parts of the male anatomy, were surgically operated on 2 times in 3 months. The pathology report of the microtesty was Sertoli cell-only syndrome with an unknown cause. Sertoli cell-only is often the precursor to testicular cancer. Over the next few months, 3 critical pieces of information came in. First, my liver enzymes showed borderline non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. From the work of Dr. Angela Slitt, we know this could indicate elevated levels of PFAS. Next, we received confirmation from Dr. Peasley on the presence of PFAS in my turnout gear. Then we received the results from my PFAS blood test. Out of the 9,252 known PFAS, I was tested for 6. I popped positive on 4 of them. My wife and I often try to focus on situations and not numbers. However, today I will tell you that my PFHSX levels are 162 times higher than the reporting limits. The problem with PFAS, outside of it causing cancer, infertility, and a litany of other diseases, is the half-life. If I left the fire service today, my PFHSX levels would take 5 years to drop 50%. As firefighters, we work in a profession where we regularly miss family outings, birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries to serve our community. My wife is required to share her husband with that community for 33% of the year. She has never complained. It never wavered in her support. However, this was the one thing that we were not willing to give up. Because of PFAS, we can't have a family in the traditional sense. However, I am happy that we still have options. We are exploring those and looking to move forward on having a family. As I share my story with you today, firefighters across this nation will be responding to help folks that are having their absolute worst day. They will do it without thinking twice. So it is hard for me to accept, in a profession where we give so much, that now we are required to sacrifice our fertility and health due to chemicals that we don't even need in our gear. I want to thank you all for your time, and thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your story. Next, we'll hear from Sean Mitchell.
Hi, Melanie. I'd like to start by thanking the Environmental Working Group for hosting this conference and for inviting me on to share our story. And I'd like to say I applaud Brian for everything that he just said. That was really incredible. So our story here began in early 2020 when a small group of firefighters here at my fire department met to discuss health and safety issues. One of those issues was PFAS exposure from both AFFF firefighting foam as well as from our turnout gear. One of the members of that group, Captain Nate Barber, was out of work at the time of that meeting as he was recovering from treatment for testicular cancer. As we researched and learned more about PFAS and the cancers it causes, it became our goal to ensure that when Nate returned to work, he would not be wearing turnout gear that contained the same PFAS chemicals which likely caused or contributed to his cancer. Unfortunately for us, for Nate, and for all of our brother and sister firefighters, we soon learned that all turnout gear contains high levels of PFAS. There is no such thing as PFAS-free gear. Nate did return to work, but he continues to be forced to wear the same gear and to be exposed to high levels of PFAS every day because the industry has refused to allow alternatives. After many months of research, it became clear that while PFAS are used in every single set of turnout gear in North America, and likely across the world, these forever chemicals are not there to keep us safe, as their presence is not essential. Firefighters are the victims of an industry that places profit above all else, with no concern for the harm they are causing to humans and our environment. The chemical, textile, and PPE manufacturers have used the same playbook that we've seen for decades, dating back to the evils of the tobacco industry. They infiltrate organizations such as the IAFF and the National Fire Protection Association, or the NFPA, where the standards that firefighters are forced to follow are created. They successfully convince these groups that their products are the only products that can be used. About 75% of firefighter line of duty deaths are caused by cancer, and collectively we know we need to do all we can to reduce that number. Eliminating the unnecessary use of cancer-causing chemicals in our PPE is a logical step in the right direction. Unfortunately, we are battling an industry that defies logic. My union decided to do something about this. Back in January of this year, Nantucket Firefighters Local 2509, along with Fall River Firefighters Local 1314 and their president Jason Burns, submitted a resolution at the IAFF convention. We sought to require that the IAFF begin to educate firefighters on the dangers of PFAS exposure, as well as to force the IAFF to separate themselves from the close relationship they had with the PFAS industry. Our resolution passed overwhelmingly with 99% of the 324,000 IAFF members voting in favor. Another resolution from our brothers and sisters in Florida, which also addressed the need for action on the unnecessary use of PFAS in our PPE, passed by the same margin, with 99% voting in favor. These resolutions, along with the change in leadership at the IAFF, have led to a renewed hope that our lives will now be placed ahead of industry profits. With the IAFF on board, we have now turned our attention to the NFPA. NFPA Standard 1971 specifies how structural firefighting gear is tested and constructed. This standard is set up so that it is impossible for turnout gear to become certified without the use of PFAS. The reason for this is simple. The PFAS industry is heavily represented on the technical committee that writes the standard. The NFPA claims that their committees have equal representation and that no one organization or industry can outnumber another. What they fail to acknowledge is that the industry's dirty work is not solely done by their own employees. They have also been successful in using some of the members who are supposed to be there to provide a balance by sponsoring their events and funding their research. There is a clear conflict of interest. The standard that forces firefighters to wear PFAS-laden gear is written by the people who profit from its sale. The manufacturers who are currently being sued all across the country for exposing us to PFAS will never admit that PFAS are a problem, because they would then be admitting their liability. Because of this, firefighters all across the United States and Canada who are forced to wear NFPA-certified turnout gear will continue to be unnecessarily exposed to PFAS until this standard is changed. But we have some hope. Very recently, a temporary interim amendment, or a TIA, was submitted to the NFPA in an effort to remove the light degradation test that turnout gear moisture barrier layers must pass to become certified. This test was placed into the standard in 2007, and since then, the only product that has been able to become certified is Teflon. This TIA was submitted by newly elected IAFF General President Ed Kelly on behalf of the 324,000 firefighters he represents. But if passed, it will have a positive impact on all firefighters who have been treated like lab rats by the chemical industry. As a part of this TIA process, the public is invited to comment on the proposed amendment. And if there are enough comments in favor, we may be able to overwhelm the pro-industry NFPA to force them to do what firefighters want them to do, which is eliminate PFAS from our turnout gear. Anyone wishing to provide a public comment can find all the information they need to do so at pfasfreeppe.com. Firefighters are diagnosed with occupational cancers every day. We're lucky to have the support of advocates like the Environmental Working Group, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, Diane and Paul Cotter, to name a few. When I joined this fight that those groups were already waging, I was fortunate to be introduced to two firefighters who have been leaders in addressing firefighter occupational cancer on a national level. Matt Elbow from the San Francisco Fire Department and Jim Bernica from the Dayton, Ohio Fire Department have spent their careers trying to make this job safe for the rest of us. In the last 8 months, both Matt and Jim were diagnosed with occupational cancer. But they continue to fight, and it's our responsibility to fight with them. Please go to PFASFreePPE.com to learn more about PFAS and firefighter turnout gear and what you can do to help Nate, Matt, Jim, and the millions of firefighters who are dealing with the long-term effects of PFAS exposure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing your story and for all of your advocacy in this space. We're last going to hear from Kevin Ferrara.
Thanks, Melanie. So first, I want to thank you and the entire EWG team for presenting this, what I consider really a historic event, and one that I hope will stir discussion within the fire departments around the world. As Melanie had said, my fire protection emergency service career spans back 33 years, with 20 of those having served in the United States Air Force. My military service began, just as many, began in 1991 at the former Chanute Air Force Base in Ranto, Illinois, where over the years, thousands of gallons of HFOF was used, penetrating the ground, coming in contact with trainees' bare skin in their eyes and mouth. We as trainees, we were told by our instructors that HFOF was just soap and water. And Chanute closed in 1993, and 25 years later, in 2018, when groundwater testing was conducted, elevated levels of PFAS contamination was found, proving PFAS is extremely persistent. So after Chanute Air Force Base, my first assignment was to Cannon Air Force Base, just outside Clovis, New Mexico, where elevated levels of PFAS have been detected in wells that supply drinking water to residents and livestock. The PFAS contamination in Clovis and Cannon area caused a local dairy farmer to destroy his milk, likely originating from the release of thousands of gallons of HFOF for years by Cannon Air Force Base firefighters like myself, who performed daily operational checks of the airport firefighting apparatus and during training and emergencies, where the foam was literally left to seep into the porous soil and into the groundwater. Every Air Force installation I was assigned to during my career has reported elevated levels of PFAS, to include my last assignment at Langley Air Force Base in Hampton, Virginia, where levels were reported at 2.2 million parts per trillion in on-base groundwater, the same water that flows into the adjacent Back River, where fish and crab are caught and sold at a local seafood market to unsuspecting consumers. During my time at Langley, no mention of the contamination was ever made to base personnel. Per the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, active duty military and civilian firefighters are now being offered blood serum tests for PFAS. Many of those firefighters who had their blood serum tested voluntarily provided me their results, which showed alarming levels of PFAS, one analyte specifically being PFHXS. Every firefighter who provided me their results presented elevated levels of PFHXS, with some whose blood serum showed levels as high as 12 times greater than the 2015-2016 CDC NHANES 95% geometric mean. Many of those active duty firefighters who've had their blood serum tested stated they were never informed of what their results mean. Those individuals are scared, fearing due to the PFAS increasing risk of cancer, they'll become sick. And unfortunately, many former military firefighters did possess cancer and die, and others, they ended up taking their own life to escape the pain and suffering of PFAS exposure. Despite active duty firefighters having blood serum tested, veterans like myself who separated or retired from the military are not eligible for blood serum testing. In fact, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs has stated they will not approve PFAS blood testing, believing the test is unnecessary due to a large majority of the U.S. population having detectable levels of PFAS, thus leaving many veterans like myself to pay out of pocket for independent blood testing, and those costs average $700 and are not reimbursable. Various reports by the U.S. military showed the military has known since the early 1970s that HFOF was harmful to fish and observing tumors developing in live animals, yet that information was never given to military firefighters. For decades, military firefighters have been exposed believing HFOF was safe, that it was simply just soap and water, while leadership and HFOF manufacturers knew otherwise. There is legislation like the Michael Leasick Military Firefighters Protection Act that is trying to make exposure to PFAS a presumptive, meaning if a firefighter, due to the nature of their work, develops cancer within certain parameters, it's presumed that that cancer is associated to HFOF and or PFAS exposure. And I just want to make clear that I don't fault the military fire instructors and fire chiefs who echoed HFOF with soap and water, simply because I believe they too were misled. For me, medically, I've been diagnosed with elevated levels of cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, and other medical conditions my doctors believe is linked to repeated PFAS exposure. And I tell my doctor, I said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When will my doctor tell me I have cancer? We as firefighters never asked to be sick. We knew the hazards of the job, but we never asked to be sick. We only wanted to serve the public and live a happy life after retirement. So, thanks again, Melanie and EWG, for this opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks again, Kevin, for sharing your story and providing so much information. The first question that I have is for Sean. So 2 questions. One, in case anyone missed it the first time, can you just share again where people should go if they want to get involved and provide comment on your campaign with the NFPA? And then second, if there are firefighters who are here listening and want to make changes within their own fire department to get gear that is less toxic, or even to take measures to protect themselves with the gear that they have so that they can reduce their exposure, what kind of advice would you offer?
Sure, thank you for that, Melanie. That website is PFASfreePPE.com. So PFASfreePPE.com. It has all sorts of information about PFAS, studies, research, and some information regarding the NFPA TIA and how to make a comment on that. And as far as what we can do right now, what we've done here is to begin to minimize our exposure to our turnout gear as much as we can. Of course, as firefighters, we're still responding to fires and all sorts of emergencies. And one of the most distressing parts of all of this is that we need that gear to keep us safe. And so we still wear it, but we don't wear it to shovel snow. We don't wear it when we're exercising or training or anything like that. We only wear it when we have to now, and that, along with just educating ourselves about PFAS in general, I think is the first step.
Great, thank you so much. And then both Brian and Kevin, you each talked a little bit about blood testing. And my understanding is that the process is a little bit different if you are still a military firefighter and your access to blood testing. And Brian, you got tested as a civilian. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit just about the logistics of getting your blood tested, if that's something that listeners are interested in, whether you are currently serving in the military or if you're a civilian firefighter.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I was actually working with VCU on trying to get a lot of the blood testing done. And what we ended up finding out through a few phone calls was we were able to kind of streamline that process. And what we found out was there's a lab in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania called NMS. And NMS, from our understanding, is the only lab on the East Coast that'll test blood. It just so happens that that lab also has a contract with LabCorp. Now, I'm not, endorsing any of this. It's just the process that we went through. So I was able to go through any LabCorp in Virginia and get my blood drawn, and then they would take that and ship it to NMS in Willow Grove. The problem with all this is it's super expensive. It runs you about $700. It's not covered under insurance. It doesn't fall under any of the presumption laws. So it was worth it for us just due to the vindication fact.
Yeah, just to chime in for military, everything is done for active duty military and DoD civilians. When they have their annual occupational health exam, they are offered, it's not mandated, they are actually offered this blood test. And if they choose to get it, their physician will with their typical labs, they'll draw vial blood send it off, and LabCorp is the company that's doing the majority of these results. And then they get the results back. But for veterans, for like myself, there's no option other than to research. Because I'm here in Pennsylvania, so LabCorp down in Willow Grove is the local one for me. There's one on the West Coast that's been doing this as well. But as Brian said, it's $700, and that's strictly out of pocket. A lot of veterans, they're living paycheck to paycheck if they're disabled and can't work. That $700 means a lot for them. They want to get the test, but they sort of have to jump through hoops to get it.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And Brian, what other advice might you offer to other members of the fire service who are experiencing health effects that they fear might be related to PFAS exposure?
Get tested. Do an exposure report every single shift. I make sure that my crew does one every single shift for the simple fact that, one, I don't want what's happened to me happen to them, and two, maybe somewhere down the line this can be included into some of our presumption laws. And a lot of that is, as we know, it's based off of documentation and trying to prove it. And I mean, if you have an exposure report being done every single shift for 14 years, it's kind of hard not to be able to prove that.
And Kevin, you were doubly exposed through turnout gear, but also through the use of PFAS and firefighting foam used by the military. Can you talk a little bit about alternatives to PFAS in foam?
Well, beginning fiscal year 2024, the NDAA states that the DoD has to go to a non-fluorinated foam. It's going to be very interesting if that happens on time. The DoD is saying that currently they have 6 non-fluorinated foams identified to swap out. But one of the big problems is when they swap out that foam from the current apparatus inventory, unless that apparatus is cleaned, once they pour the non-fluorinated foam into the apparatus, there's going to be cross-contamination. But in terms of turnout gear, several years ago, the Air Force, the DoD pretty much switched to structural turnout gear. We transitioned from proximity to structural. And unbeknownst to us, PFAS was in the turnout gear as well. So, we get a double dose. And just to clarify, AFFF is used by municipal departments as well. It's not just in the military. So there's municipal fire departments that are using PFAS or fluorinated foam out there. So they're also getting double dose of PFAS exposure. And I totally agree with Brian. Get tested to simply show if you've been exposed or have elevated levels.
And we just have a couple of minutes left, so just one more question open to any of you. We got a question about just sort of the logistics of exposure to PFAS through your turnout gear. Can anyone explain just how it is that you're exposed through your work?
Sure. So, as I said, every set of turnout gear that is NFPA certified contains high levels of PFAS. So we are being exposed by skin absorption. So it migrates off and we're absorbing it into our bloodstream. It's been found that through degradation of the textiles, it attaches to the dust in fire stations. So we're also inhaling it and ingesting it via the dust. So even when we're not wearing our turnout gear and absorbing this PFAS through our skin, simply by being near it in the fire station or in our vehicles or in the fire trucks, we are breathing PFAS in and ingesting it throughout our entire shift.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers for sharing your stories, for sharing so much valuable information, and just being available today. That's all we have time for. If you were in the audience and we weren't able to answer your question, we do have more resources on the PFAS conference website as well as the EWG website. And if you're sticking around, our next session will be a general session with EWG Senior Scientist David Andrews and Representative Chris Pappas of New Hampshire. So thanks again and have a great day.